Welcome to this webinar presentation brought to you by Valve Performance in conjunction with Griffith University. My name is Tyler Collins and I'm a second year PhD candidate with the School of Allied Health Sciences at Griffith University, Gold Coast, Australia. Together with my supervisors, Dr. Laura Diamond, Dr. Matthew Bourne and Professor Rod Barrett, we're investigating field-based testing and injury prevention strategies in female football players. Today I'm going to share some details on the work we've been doing to date and present some initial findings. This will include unpublished results from our systematic review on risk factors for female team and court sport athletes, as well as some details on a large data set of strength and biomechanical data collected across junior and senior elite level female Australian football rules and soccer players. So historically, less sports medicine research has been conducted on females compared to males. As you can see in this figure showing the relative number of females to male participants in 3 of the biggest sports medicine journals. It's quite common for study participants to be mixed, and males and females aren't often analysed separately. As a result of this, there's certain areas of sports medicine research that are lacking evidence and data for female injury prevention, particularly at the elite level, which is relatively new in some sports. While it's often tempting to assume that what is effective for male athletes is also effective for female athletes, it's important we consider the interaction of factors specific to females, such as hormones and anatomy, biomechanics, and the social factors that perhaps influence players' training history. As with many team sports, lower limb injuries are prevalent in female football. Around 70% of players are expected to experience some form of lower limb injury per season. Compared to males, females generally experience fewer total number of injuries, however incur severe injuries at a greater rate, which is due to the greater number of ankle and knee ligament injuries. The impact of injury is well recognised and has widespread effects. In addition to the playing time loss experienced by players also suffer short and long-term health consequences, decreased performance, which in turn may impact the overall team success. And of course, there's the large associated healthcare costs. So as a result, injury prevention is key for all players participating in football codes. When we consider the lower limb injuries that potentially have the most impact on female players, we can think about the trade-off between how common an injury is versus how severe an injury may be. On one side, we have uncommon but devastating injuries such as ACL ruptures, while on the other end of the spectrum, we have injuries like hip and groin pain and thigh strains, which may not cause as much time loss, but affect a much larger number of players. Within the research, injury has often been defined as requiring time loss, but when incorporating a broader non-time loss injury definition of pain and dysfunction, the numbers show that the prevalence of injuries such as hip and groin pain may be much more common than previously reported, including in female athletes. As an initial step to developing injury prevention training, it's important to understand the factors that increase players' risk of injury. We recently performed a systematic review of prospective studies investigating injury risk factors in female-only cohorts of team and field court sport athletes. So the search returned around 70 articles, and there's a wide range of factors that have been investigated with roughly 200 distinct variables and test types that have been analysed as risk factors for lower limb injuries. The majority of these studies included multiple sport cohorts, making it difficult or impossible to analyse risk factors for specific sporting codes. Most studies looked at risk factors for lower limb injury in general, often grouping any injury to the lower limb together. While there were also many studies that specifically analysed ACL injury risk factors, followed by injuries grouped by the ankle or knee region. There were very few studies that investigated thigh or hip and groin risk factors in female athletes, For the factors that were able to be synthesized in a meta-analysis, prior ACL, knee, and ankle injury were most commonly associated with future recurrent injury of the same type. So prior injury was one of the most prevalent risk factors. Age, weight, height, and BMI were also associated with risk of any lower limb injury, as well as specifically ACL injury. However, if you look at the figures on the right, the difference between players who go on to get injured and those who remain uninjured is very, very small, and perhaps so small that it's trivial. Single leg hop for distance and the difference between legs in hop distance was also seen to be a risk factor for ankle injury. However, out of the many factors that were analysed across the studies, the remaining tests and variables were typically not associated with injury risk. This was mainly due to perhaps only one study investigating a risk factor, and often where there were multiple studies, there was conflicting evidence between those studies. So some examples of those that are perhaps popular tests routinely used in sports medicine, such as the drop vertical jump, the STAR excursion balance test, and functional movement screen, these all showed conflicting evidence for a relationship with injury. It was quite common for a landmark study that introduces the test to the literature to show a significant result, and then studies that have been conducted subsequently have failed to replicate those prospective study results. One thing to consider with the results of this systematic review and similar ones is that often it requires 3 to 4 big prospective studies to get an accurate estimate of a risk factor. And so variables that are commonly measured, such as age, height, and weight, they often appear as the only significant risk factor because they have sufficient studies behind them to make a conclusion, where risk factors that are more difficult to measure haven't been investigated as much. And so you're more likely to get a large, inaccurate estimate and conflicting evidence. To supplement the meta-analysis, we also performed a best evidence synthesis with comparable risk factors. This figure on screen shows the different risk factors that we analysed down the left side of the figure and the different lower limb injury types across the top. The dot colour indicates the direction and strength of association, with green having a positive association as a risk factor and red indicating that the factor is not associated with injury. So in addition to the meta-analysis results, isometric hip external rotation was associated with any lower limb injury, and knee injury and osteoarthritis score, the KOOS score, was related to future knee injury. As with the meta-analysis, many factors had conflicting evidence between studies, and this can be seen in the dot with the neutral colour. So overall, from a systematic review, there isn't strong and consistent evidence to support many of the factors believed to be associated with injury risk in females. And this really comes down to a lack of studies and consistent studies. And it's also perhaps heavily influenced by some of the limitations to do with prospective studies. So in doing this review, there were several methodological limitations that perhaps should be addressed in future studies to advance our knowledge on risk factors. The first one was a low number of injuries. And so most studies fall below the 20 to 50 injuries required to make a statistically sort of sound estimate. And this is a challenge for prospective studies, particularly for the more uncommon injuries where you perhaps need 500 or more participants to get this number of injuries. To overcome this, it's best to find ways if we can test players in greater numbers, or perhaps sharing data will be beneficial to overcome those challenges. Also, injuries are multifactorial. Often studies are measuring a single variable, and associating with injury. And it's possible that we need more complex models that are measuring multiple variables and analyzing these simultaneously. The other factor is that physical characteristics are dynamic and they change over time. A lot of these studies are measuring things in pre-season and associating it with injury, which occurs months or years later. And so ideally, the closer we can get the testing to the time of injury, the likely the more informative it is. And the last point is a lot of studies were grouping injuries of the lower limb together. And so the more we can investigate specific injuries that involve similar structures and similar mechanisms of injury, the more valid the analysis is likely to be. So moving on to the data collection that we performed, player testing and injury screening is a widespread part of the injury prevention process. But it's clear from our systematic review that many of the tests are not associated with injury in female athletes, or there is a lack of consistent evidence. So we were interested in looking at the association between pre-season testing and injury. And as mentioned, one of the challenges with performing a prospective study such as this is obtaining enough data. And so we chose to use the field-based equipment from Veld Performance, which gives us the ability to bring the testing to the teams around Australia. And it provides evidence for testing systems that are more likely to be used by sports medicine practitioners working in the field, opposed to doing a laboratory-based study, which is only really accessible by very few athletes. So towards the end of 2019, we collected data from 383 female players, traveling around several of the elite women's W League soccer teams and AFLW clubs in Australia. We also went along to the National Training Centre State Tournament for under 17 girls in Canberra. We were lucky to receive funding from a Sports Medicine Australia Research Foundation grant, and thanks to Veld for assisting with some of the travel costs. The study was also only possible due to the help of the AFLW and W League teams and the excellent management and medical staff that helped arrange the testing, as well as Football Australia for inviting us to the National Training Centre tournament. The testing battery performed included Nordic hamstring curls using the NordBoard and isometric hip adduction and abduction using the force frame. Players also performed bilateral counter movement jumps using the force decks, portable force platforms, and a single leg hopping task using the Human-Track markerless motion capture system. The objective of the study was to analyse risk factors for knee ligament injuries, hip and groin pain, and hamstring strains, as well as we were interested in looking at the data and looking at injuries retrospectively and cross-sectionally between subgroups within our data. So currently this data is being analysed and being prepared for publication. And so I'll be able to provide you with some of the preliminary results, looking at the cross-sectional and retrospective comparisons. So one of the first objectives we had in mind with this data set was to be able to provide practitioners who are working with female players from junior to elite levels with a normative data set so they can compare their own test results to it. So this data will hopefully be publishing shortly and will include absolute and relative strength as well as between leg asymmetries for the hip adductors, hip abductors, hamstrings, and peak forces and asymmetries during jumping and landing. So if this data set is something that's of interest to you, keep an eye out for that. Our next objective was to compare players between 3 different playing groups. So each group represents different characteristics such as age and playing experience. The under 17 soccer players were generally younger than the W League or AFLW players, while the W League players reported a greater number of years playing sport than the other 2 cohorts. So while the AFL players typically had played only a few seasons, it's quite likely that they'd transitioned from another sport. In terms of strength, AFLW players produced greater NordBord scores than the other two groups, including when accounting for the effect of body weight and limb length. But there was no differences between junior and senior soccer players in Nordic scores. Hip strength also did not differ between any of the groups. There is a slight effect of age on strength, which I'll show you in the next slide, but otherwise the scores were relatively similar between those three cohorts. In terms of jump landing ground reaction forces, AFLW players had slightly greater vertical jump heights, and they also had greater peak force when jumping, and that greater peak force when landing. So it's potentially due to jumping higher, and it was also those differences disappear when you account for body weight. So overall, AFLW players slightly stronger in Nordics, and perhaps slightly more explosive than the other two groups. While when you consider the senior versus the junior soccer players, there was really very few differences in all of the tests. So to further examine the effect of age on strength, these three figures show the correlation between age and Nordic force corrected for body weight and leg length, and hip adduction and abduction force also accounting for leg length. So there is a small correlation between strength and age. However, one thing these figures do highlight is the large variation in strength that you can expect within players of the same age. So this adds to the difficulties of interpreting this sort of test data and distinguishing a low score from a high score, because it really is highly specific to the player. And so this interperson variation also sort of ties into the reason why deriving a relationship between test scores and injury risk is perhaps quite difficult to achieve. We also investigated the effect of prior ACL injury on strength and jump landing forces. The largest difference observed was in Nordic force asymmetry, with lower force generated by the previously uninjured leg. And this is possibly the result of surgery, where many of the athletes were likely received a hamstring tendon graft. And this reconstruction surgery is known to leave lasting strength deficits. Interestingly, hip abduction force was higher in those with prior ACL injury. Perhaps this is due to their rehabilitation programs, while other theories in the literature have suggested this may be an adaptation to the higher frontal plane moments at the knee and hip. The ACL injured players tend to demonstrate. There are also differences, although not statistically different, in jump impulses and tendency to land with greater peak force on the uninjured limb. So as previous studies have suggested, this kind of ground reaction force symmetry testing may be useful to determine whether a player is showing compensatory patterns or whether they're relying on one leg more than the other. Another comparison we did was between players with different severity of hip and groin pain, using the hip and groin outcome score pain subscale, the HAGOS score. Hip adduction and hip abduction force were relatively similar between those with and without pain. And once again, the interplay of variability and strength likely prevents understanding the true relationship between pain and strength in an analysis such as this. And so it's likely that establishing individual players' baseline scores and monitoring over time is key when trying to understand the effect of strain, strength, and pain on one another. So where to from here? From the research point of view, to advance the field and produce evidence-based injury prevention for female athletes, obtaining data is often the key limiting factor. The insights that large data sets with a well thought out study design can provide is invaluable. A lot of this can be achieved with collaboration between researchers, sporting bodies and tech companies. And so I would encourage all of those in these areas to consider how they can help in enabling further projects to take place. If any of the results presented here are of interest to you, keep an eye out for the full publications coming in the following months. We also have further results from prospective analysis on risk factors that will hopefully be available towards the end of the year. And then following that, our objective is to move towards investigating evidence-based injury prevention training that is specific to female athletes in future projects. Thank you for listening to this webinar. If you have any questions or like updates on the project, feel free to get in touch with me with the email on screen. Thanks.